Senator Grassley and I and other members have multiple committee hearings taking place during the day, and where you stand in the queue in those other committees depends on whether you've checked in person. So Senator Grassley and I were both checking in person in finance, and I thank you all for your patience. We're going to start with opening remarks by me and Senator Grassley, then I'll introduce the witnesses. We'll proceed with 5-minute statements and then go on to questions and answers. I want to welcome everyone to what is our 7th committee hearing on the economic and budgetary perils of our overdependence on fossil fuels. We have heard repeated testimony from nonpartisan, knowledgeable industry leaders about the threat climate change poses to entire sectors of our economy: healthcare, insurance, coastal economies, wildfire areas, and of course the carbon bubble, leaving fossil fuel assets stranded. So in light of those threats and warnings, what are we, the federal government, doing to protect the American people? Well, actually what we're doing is subsidizing the danger. As we'll hear today, the United States subsidizes the fossil fuel industry with taxpayer dollars. It's not just the U.S. According to the International Energy Agency, the fossil fuel handouts hit a global high of $1 trillion in 2022, the same year that big oil pulled in a record $4 trillion of income. You see the dependence on public funds. In the United States, by some estimates, taxpayers pay about $20 billion every year to the fossil fuel industry. What do we get for that? Economists generally agree, not much. To quote conservative economist Gib Metcalf, these subsidies offer, and I quote, little if any benefit in the form of oil patch jobs, lower prices at the pump, or increased energy security for the country. The cash subsidy to big oil is both big and wrong. But the really big subsidy is the license to pollute for free. The IMF calls this global free pass an implicit fossil fuel subsidy. Economists call it an unpriced externality. Behind these benign-sounding phrases occurs a lot of harm. Start with the harmful effects of local air pollution. Researchers from Harvard found pollutants from oil and gas combustion were responsible for 8.7 million premature deaths annually. The increased mortality rates from heat and air pollution we heard about at last week's hearing. Then, growing costs from intensifying disasters, wildfires, floods, droughts, which according to the OMB could cost the federal budget $2 trillion annually and reduce U.S. GDP 3 to 10% by the end of the century. You tally up the harms, and the International Monetary Fund estimates that the penalty is a $5.4 trillion annual subsidy worldwide. In the United States, it's a $646 billion subsidy every single year. Worse, this almost certainly undercounts the true costs. The London School of Economics reports that studies often underestimate the harm of climate dangers by failing to account for, as we've heard in these hearings, how hazards can cascade across ecological and economic systems. The cascades can cause irreparable damage to human well-being, to ecosystems, and to the U.S. economy. These are the systemic risks that we've been hearing about in these hearings. And as we'll hear from one of our witnesses today, the very act of extracting these dirty fuels has terrible consequences for human health, especially for children. From high rates of birth defects to childhood leukemia, there's ample evidence that communities around oil and gas extraction sites pay an especially high price. It is textbook economics that the price of a product should reflect its true cost. The fossil fuel industry violates this rule of market economies. It does so by spending billions of dollars on disinformation, false doubt, climate obstruction, and political dark money. And why not? To protect one of the most lucrative subsidies in human history. This, ladies and gentlemen, is why we can't have nice things like clean air, safe coral reefs, secure coastlines, and affordable clean energy. Over in the House, MAGA extremists are doubling down on polluter handouts to their big donors with their Default on America Act that puts the American taxpayer on the hook for climate disaster. That bill is not about debts or deficits. It's dirty work for an industry that controls one of the main political parties in this country. Oil and gas extraction represents only about 5% of GDP. Farming, manufacturing, food and beverage, insurance, finance, restaurants, retail, housing, healthcare, all represent a larger share of GDP. Clean energy now accounts for more employment than the fossil fuel industry. But for political influence, to protect those massive subsidies, nothing compares to fossil fuel. It is a fundamental principle of democracy that everyone should get an equal say. But with fossil fuel, the rich and the powerful hoard all the benefits for themselves and leave everyone else, often the most vulnerable Americans, to pay the price. Senator Grassley.
Last week's hearing on climate change and public health was another missed opportunity to discuss our nation's ailing fiscal health. That same day, House Republicans passed legislation to rein in excessive government spending, lift the debt ceiling, and impose meaningful fiscal controls. Meanwhile, Senate Democrats haven't lifted a single finger. Now, instead of working together to write a responsible budget, we're here discussing an alleged scheme involving fossil fuel overlords. Rather than attacking important American businesses that employ tens of thousands of Americans, we should work together to reduce an unsustainable national debt. Reaching a consensus will require us to respectfully listen to opinions of experts whose views may differ from our own. No one learns anything sitting in an echo chamber. This is one reason why I've invited witnesses with a variety of views during this series of climate change hearings. Sometimes I've discussed with a witness that I invited on this or that subject, but sometimes I've disagreed with witnesses I've invited on this or that, but I value their opinions. Today is no different with Ms. Roth, and I don't see eye to eye on all energy matters, particularly when it comes to renewable fuels and wind. However, we do agree oil and gas are critical to lowering energy costs, protecting our national security, and reducing CO2 emissions. We also agree that President Biden's war on fossil fuels has been disastrous for the economy and terrible for consumers. I believe in all of the above energy strategies: oil, gas, biofuel, wind. We need them, all for national security and for economic success. President Biden, on the other hand, believes in all of the history of his preferred and none of the rest strategy. It's kind of simple. In this town, people say they're all of the above. Well, half of them are for none of the above, but everything below. And the other half are for everything above above, but nothing below the ground. This sort of one-size-fits-all to solving this problem just doesn't make sense. I've been saying for 30 years, long time before climate change was much of a debate, that we had 4 goals that we had to have for energy policy. 1, fossil fuels. Number 2, all the alternative energy you can think of. And number 3, conservation, both government imposed and personally imposed. And 4, nuclear. It seems to me that that's still a policy we're going to have for the next 25 years, except for the unrealistic views that we can get everything by wind tomorrow. Poor policy decisions have consequences. And as a result, we've seen energy prices rise substantially across the board. This is why the 2 leading topics of concern that I've heard from Iowans during the Biden administration have been inflation and the price of gasoline. The president can deflect blame all he wants, but the rise in the price of gasoline has been a direct consequence of his administration's energy policies. Candidate Biden vowed to end fossil fuels during his campaign. On his first day in office, he decided to shut down the Keystone Pipeline, stifling our ongoing energy independence and killing thousands of jobs. Also on January 2021, he issued an executive order pausing new oil and gas leases on public lands and federal waters. And now he complains because Saudi is cutting down on the pumping of oil by $1 million a day and the price going up. And we've reduced the National Strategic Reserve to the lowest level in 40 years. It just doesn't make sense that we would stop jobs in this country to increase more jobs in Saudi Arabia and import the oil here, and probably dirtier oil than we'd produce in this country. A barrage of his destructive environmental regulations followed, which continue to prevent the construction of much-needed fossil fuel infrastructure. Last month, President Biden issued his first veto to uphold his 401k investment rule. The rule will even hurt everyday Americans' investment, just to further liberal environmental, social, corporate governance, or ESG as you know it. Whereas the federal law requires, under ERISA, that the fiduciary has a responsibility to make sure that you get the most return on your money. That's what the law says. And this administration, through ESG, is violating that law. And just a few weeks later, President Biden's EPA announced its plan to mandate 2/3 of all new vehicles by electric by 2032. These are the same EVs most Americans can't afford, the same EVs that they say in California last year don't plug in during the heavy use of utilities because you may not get the electricity to charge your EV. But Democrats want to continue subsidizing these as part of their misnamed Inflation Reduction Act, which by now the CBO has proven to us not going to reduce inflation, but actually enhance inflation. And that's that green energy program that's within that bill that has a price tag that seems to be ballooning way above what CBO said it was going to be. And to prove that, we have the Joint Committee on Taxation telling us its tax subsidies will cost $300 billion more than originally advertised, and its cost could rise further once we see updated scores of EV subsidies. The average price of an electric vehicle, according to Kelley Blue Book, is $65,000, roughly the equivalent of Iowa's median household income. But even if half of the Americans could afford an EV, which they can't, an even bigger problem exists. We have neither the load capacity nor the materials to achieve President Biden's energy overhaul. Large swaths of the U.S. electric grid are at risk for shortfalls this summer. Grid reliability is a significant concern already, let alone the concerns over the grid handling load of the President Biden's electric vehicle fantasy. Moreover, we all know that the Communist Party of China has a monopoly on critical mineral mining and refining required to build EV batteries. They're forcing Uyghurs into slavery to bolster their supply chains. That's all being supported by this administration. Meanwhile, environmentalists won't allow us to permit mining projects here in the United States. And think of the inconsistency between the human rights policies of this administration, which I have no disagreement with, but letting the Uyghurs with forced labor to produce some of the stuff that we're going to use in our electric vehicle cars. Or look at what, I think it's cobalt or something else that we get from the Congo Republic, that child labor is being used to produce. And this administration and the Republicans in this Congress are against using child labor for anything as far as that's concerned. So not only is this administration pushing policies that drive up the price of gasoline, but their policies would make us even more dependent on a supply chain that runs directly through China. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. Let me just take a moment and salute you for your long-term leadership on conservation issues, on alternative fuels, particularly ethanol, and on wind power, which is so important in your home state. I appreciate that.
I'm the father of the wind energy tax credit.
There you go, exactly, and have defended it very strongly. I appreciate that. It's one of the places we work together.
60% of our electricity from wind, and in 4 years, we'll get about 80%.
And for what it's worth, my Chevy Bolt is very affordable. Let me turn first. Let me introduce the witnesses. We have Ted Gayer here. He's the president of the Niskanen Center. He was formerly the executive vice president of the Brookings Institute. He served as deputy assistant secretary for microeconomic analysis at the Department of Treasury and as a senior economist on the Council of Economic Advisors under President George W. Bush. We welcome his testimony. Next, we have Dr. Nicole Deziel, who is an associate professor at the Yale School of Public Health. She's an expert on the human health impacts of oil and gas development. Her work has contributed to the field's understanding of the underlying exposure mechanisms, the unequal distribution of the health impacts, and the policies for mitigating these dangerous hazards. We look forward to her testimony. Finally, Ms. Diana Furtgott-Roth is the director of the Center for Energy, Climate, and the Environment at the Heritage Foundation and an adjunct professor at GW. She was formerly a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and the Hudson Institute, as well as a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. She served in the White House under Presidents Reagan, George H.W. Bush, W. Bush, and was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Research and Technology at the Department of Transportation, as well as Acting Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at Treasury during the Trump administration. Dr. Gayer, welcome. You have 5 minutes to deliver your statement.
Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today. My name is Ted Gayer, and I'm the president of the Niskanen Center. As Senator Whitehouse said, I previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of Treasury and as Senior Economist at the Council of Economic Advisors, both in the George W. Bush administration. I want to address 3 points today. First, instead of providing subsidies to fossil fuels, our tax code should promote market incentives that factor in the external costs of energy use. Second, the size of the existing fossil fuel subsidies depends on various factors, such as whether one is focusing on their overall size or their size compared to subsidies granted to other industries, as well as whether, as Senator Whitehouse mentioned, one accounts for the external costs of fossil fuels. And third, eliminating fossil fuels would have a minimal impact on both fossil fuel production and prices. Historically, federal energy tax policies have, at various times, sought to boost domestic energy production, generate tax revenue, and promote environmental quality. These goals are often in conflict, such as when we impose a gas guzzler tax to reduce fuel consumption, while we simultaneously subsidize oil production to increase output. Energy tax policy should instead address the sizable external costs of energy consumption, such as the costs associated with climate change and particulate pollution, by implementing a carbon tax that encourages consumers and producers to reduce emissions through market incentives. However, the presence of fossil fuel subsidies in the current tax code contradicts this goal. Most fossil fuel subsidies are implemented as tax expenditures in our tax code. The Joint Committee on Taxation, which I will refer to as JCT, defines a tax expenditure as a provision that deviates from their baseline income tax. If one instead considers a consumption tax as a baseline tax system, then many current provisions would not qualify as tax expenditures. Furthermore, several fossil fuel tax expenditures apply to other industries within and outside the energy sector, so their magnitude depends on whether one is interested in their overall size or the size compared to subsidies granted to other industries. There are 4 significant types of tax provisions for fossil fuels: cost recovery, the treatment of inventories, the treatment of foreign profits, and tax credits. JCT classifies most provisions within these categories as tax expenditures. According to JCT, the total value of fossil fuel tax expenditures from 2022 to 2026 will be approximately $12 billion. However, this estimate would be smaller if one considers the size of these expenditures relative to other industries. For example, the last in, first out accounting method and some accelerated depreciation provisions apply to all industries under current law. It's also worth noting that not all oil and natural gas companies can fully benefit from these tax provisions. For example, small non-integrated oil and gas producers get a more generous treatment than big integrated oil and gas producers in expensing of intangible drilling costs. Fossil fuel subsidies are unlikely to help increase production in the United States significantly. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that fossil fuel subsidies led to a minimal impact of about 0.5% more domestic oil production. The U.S. Treasury and academic studies, such as the one Senator Whitehouse alluded to, also find similarly small effects of these subsidies on domestic production. This means that they currently do not achieve the goal of insulating domestic prices from foreign supply disruptions, particularly since prices are determined in the global market. In conclusion, fossil fuel subsidies move us away from energy prices that accurately represent the extensive external costs associated with their use. My preferred policy is a border-adjusted carbon tax that creates incentives to account for the costs of energy use. This would provide incentives for businesses to innovate, to use cleaner energy sources, and to invest in more carbon-efficient production techniques. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Grassley, thank you once more for the opportunity to speak today, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Deziel?
Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and distinguished members of the Senate Budget Committee, it is an honor to participate in today's hearing. My name is Nicole Deziel, and I'm an associate professor at the Yale School of Public Health in the Department of Environmental Health Sciences. My testimony will address the human health impacts of oil and gas development. These remarks are informed by a strong body of evidence, including my own 9 years of research and more than 25 publications on the exposures, health, and environmental justice impacts of oil and gas development. I have 5 points to share today. First, living near oil and gas development has been associated with a range of health problems, with the greatest evidence of risks reported for children. In 2021, there were nearly 1 million oil and gas wells in operation and approximately 18 million U.S. residents living within 1 mile of an oil and gas well. More than 50 peer-reviewed epidemiologic studies, including some from my own research group, provide evidence of a relationship between oil and gas development and adverse health outcomes, such as birth defects, childhood leukemia, hospitalizations, asthma exacerbations, mental health issues, and mortality among the elderly. The weight of evidence indicates that the risk of adverse health outcomes increases with a greater proximity to or density of oil and gas wells around people's homes. The strongest evidence is for health in newborn babies, such as birth defects, preterm birth, and low birth weight. Such associations have been observed across numerous states, including Pennsylvania, Colorado, Ohio, California, Texas, and Oklahoma. The consistency of results across multiple studies that were conducted using different methodologies in different locations during different time periods and different populations provides confidence in this body of research. 2, a growing number of environmental monitoring studies have concluded that oil and gas development contributes to air pollution, noise, odors, water contamination, radioactive releases, seismic activity, and increased traffic. 3, exposures and health risks are not distributed equally across communities, with disproportionate impacts for some disadvantaged populations. As we have seen time and time again with other industrial and hazardous sites, certain subgroups of the population, such as communities of color or lower income, bear a disproportionate burden of exposures and health risks from oil and gas development. For example, studies in Texas and Ohio demonstrated that oil and gas wastewater disposal wells were more likely to be sited in communities of color or areas of lower income. In Texas, Hispanic populations were more likely to be exposed to flaring, a practice of burning excess gas, yielding light at night, noise, and noxious odors. We found that communities with high proportion of lower income and elderly populations in rural areas were the most vulnerable to groundwater pollution from hydraulic fracturing in the Appalachian Basin. Finally, a recent California study found that Black, Hispanic, and socioeconomically marginalized people had disproportionately higher exposure to oil and gas wells. 4, the limited availability of monitoring data, particularly in rural areas where substantial drilling occurs, is a challenge to understanding the hazards and risks fully. 5, multiple complementary strategies would more adequately address oil and gas hazards and better protect community health. One of the most commonly used policy protections for communities near oil and gas wells currently are setbacks, which is the allowable distance between an oil and gas well and a sensitive receptor, such as home or school. The utility of setbacks is based on the premise that hazards emitted by oil and gas operations attenuate with distance. While setbacks do offer critical public health protections to nearby communities, many states have not updated them to reflect the current science, and it is challenging to establish a universal distance that protects against all hazards because hazards decrease at different rates. Furthermore, setbacks do nothing to prevent the release of methane or other greenhouse gases that contribute to climate change. In conclusion, there is clear evidence for health hazards from oil and gas development, and these are not being adequately addressed by current policies. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Doctor. And now, Ms. Roth, welcome.
Thank you very much. Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, thanks for giving me the opportunity to testify today about who pays the price of President Biden's energy policies. I direct the Center for Energy, Climate, and Environment at the Heritage Foundation, and I'm an adjunct professor at George Washington University. Let me start out by saying that I'm an American due to fossil fuels. My father, on a job interview here in 1967, was so impressed that Americans heated the bathrooms that he moved his whole family here from London. In London, my dad heated the house with kerosene heaters, filling them up every night, which gives me a profound appreciation both for fossil fuels and for central heating systems. Poor and middle-class people pay a steep price for President Biden's energy agenda. They suffer a decline in value, safety, and security, while the regulations do not mitigate climate change because emissions are simply displaced to China and other poorer countries. Americans' oil and gas jobs are being sacrificed to Chinese making wind turbines and solar panels. Americans' auto jobs are being sacrificed to Chinese making batteries and mining for rare earth minerals. Sometimes Chinese slaves and child workers are taking these American jobs. We're supposedly doing all this to improve the climate, but displacing energy-intensive manufacturing to China does not reduce global emissions. In order to produce renewables, China is increasing its construction of coal-fired power plants. America has 225 coal-fired power plants, and China has over 1,000. That's half of all the coal-fired power plants in the world. That's one reason why China has increased carbon emissions by over 5,000 million metric tons over the past 16 years, while America's carbon emissions have declined by 1,000 million metric tons due to the use of our clean natural gas. Last week, Stellantis, after closing an Illinois plant in December, announced it would be cutting 3,500 jobs in Detroit due to its forced transition to electric vehicles. GM and Ford are also laying off workers for the same reason. United Auto Worker President Shawn Fain said on April 26th, quote, "This is a slap in the face to our members, their families, their communities, and the American people who saved this company 15 years ago. Even now, politicians and taxpayers are bankrolling the electric vehicle transition, and this is the thanks the working class gets," unquote. In April, the Joint Tax Committee estimated that green tax credits from the Inflation Reduction Act will cost taxpayers $570 billion from 2023 to 2033. As of 2022, wind and solar power produce less than 6% of our domestic primary energy consumption. The reality is that the federal government is spending billions on renewables, making electricity disproportionately more expensive for poor people. Fossil fuel companies generate tax revenues for federal, state, and local governments. The oil and gas extraction industry paid 19% of income in federal taxes in 2018, compared to 11% for industries as a whole. In order to comply with EPA's recent proposed rules to regulate tailpipe emissions, 60% of vehicles would have to be battery-powered electric in 2030. These regulations would make new and used cars disproportionately more expensive for the poor and middle-class people who can least afford them. The Department of Energy also wants to regulate other appliances, depriving Americans of the ability to have a simple gas stove. Poor and middle-class people will be disproportionately paying higher appliance prices. Fossil fuels are essential for fertilizers and agriculture. If the world gives up its agricultural security, countries will see higher food costs and decreased food access, with poor people disproportionately paying the price for higher food costs. Already this year, U.S. food prices have risen over 8%. Eggs are over $4 a box, and milk is over $4 a gallon. President Biden's plan to transition away from fossil fuels is making the United States weaker and China stronger, without noticeable effects on global temperatures. Thank you for allowing me to testify today.
Let me begin with a few questions for Dr. Gayer, if I mind. Doctor, your doctorate is in economics, correct?
Yes, sir.
Could you explain what economists mean by the term externality, particularly in the context of fossil fuels?
I'd be delighted to. I'll do it in an economist talk. You actually did a much better job, I think, when you talked about subsidizing the license to pollute for free. The idea of textbook economics is you want the market price to reflect the cost of producing the good that you're selling. And in most cases, the market does a fine job of that, and we would not need to have any hearings or, I would hope, government involvement in it. But we need to account, especially when it concerns the environment, that when a production process is causing health costs, such as Nicole had referred to, or climate costs, as you and I had talked to, those costs are not going to be reflected in the market price. And so the economic prescription for that is simple, which is to try and set a tax equal to that price so that not to shut down a market, not to penalize unnecessarily. It's not a matter of retribution. It's a matter of what makes good economic sense and accounts for the cost of the production of a good. So that's internalized into the production and consumption decisions, and it relies on the power of prices in order to allocate these goods accordingly.
Simply put, if you had two factories on the same river, and one was throwing all its trash and waste into the river, and the other was paying to have it cleaned up, that would be an unfair subsidy of the one that was throwing all its trash and waste in the river, correct?
Yes, that's much more eloquently put than my textbook example, but yes.
If we were to do a carbon price, that creates the risk of giving advantage to overseas competitors. And your testimony calls for your carbon price idea to be border adjusted.
Yes.
Could you explain what you mean by it being border adjusted and what kind of effect that would have on pollution from other countries, specifically China and India?
Yes. So one of the attributes of a carbon tax is relative to a lot of other policies, it's actually not super complicated to administer. You levy the tax at the source. If it's a domestic source, you levy it at the coal mine or the wellhead. But if you were to just stop there, then imported goods their prices would not reflect the carbon content of their goods, and as you said, would give an unfair advantage to foreign imports. And so the idea of a border-adjusted tax is to make sure that any goods that we import, their costs reflect the same external costs that domestic producers are facing. And so you would adjust the tax and make sure that they are subject to the same tax. The advantage of doing so, I would say, are twofold. One is in the realm of economics, as you said. It would alleviate or eliminate any competitive advantage that foreign companies would have in exporting to the United States if we had a carbon tax. And two is less about economics and more about diplomacy, and we need to get to a world where we are leading the world in addressing climate change, and doing so and levying a tax internally and also on products that people sell to the United States is a clear signal that we need reciprocity, and this needs to be a global solution.
The EU just passed its carbon border adjustment mechanism. They call it their CBAM. That will put tariffs on United States goods and far steeper tariffs on Chinese goods, and they suggest that that will move the European supply chain from China to the United States, increasing jobs and manufacturing here in the United States, specifically in steel, aluminum, cement, pharma, and other major industries. Does that sound right to you? And how did domestic industries benefit proper carbon border adjustment?
I don't know the particular of their pricings. It does sound right to me, and I believe their pricing is, again, reflecting the relative carbon content of the goods that China versus the U.S. exports, and to the extent that we are less carbon intensive than the Chinese, we would be subject to less of a levy, which would make us more competitive on those industries.
Dr. Deziel, your publications that you mentioned are peer-reviewed.
That's correct.
What does that mean to the layman listening?
Yes, peer review is the process we use in the scientific community to ensure the quality of existing research. So when we submit journals for publication, they undergo intense scrutiny from multiple other scientists who are not involved with the work to check the numbers, check the assumptions, check the interpretation, and make sure the studies are valid.
Your work focuses on your multiple observations that proximity to oil and gas production facilities has enormous health effects, adverse health effects on children. What would you say is the specific vector for that, and with specific reference to methane, if you would?
Yes, thank you for the question, Senator. Oil and gas releases so many hazards that it's quite complex. There's potential for air pollution, the methane emissions, water contamination, the stress of having your community disrupted, increased traffic. So most studies have not pinpointed the exact factor, and likely it's a combination of multiple factors that are contributing to some immediate harms like birth defects, but also methane is contributing indirectly. It's not toxic to children who live nearby, but it's contributing to climate change, which is certainly harmful for the next generation.
Senator Grassley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My first three questions will be to Ms. Fershot Roth. We've heard references to an IMF study that claims the fossil fuel industry receives $660 billion in annual subsidies from our country, our government. According to President Biden's own budget, repealing all specific oil and gas-related tax preferences would raise only $45 billion over 10 years, a far cry from the $660 billion. Would you please explain how the IMF arrives at a ridiculous inflated figure?
Sure, yes, thank you for the question. Well, this is a working paper that does not represent the view of the IMF, as its authors say at the beginning, and it has not been peer-reviewed or published in a peer-reviewed journal, the way that Dr. Deziel's articles have been. Several features of the working paper are worth noting. China has $2.2 trillion in subsidies, the United States supposedly $660 billion in subsidies. The IMF uses the word subsidies to include not just direct taxpayer support for fuel use, but an estimate of environmental costs for the combustion of the fuel. Nearly half of the subsidy calculations are related to coal use. In fact, to the extent that onshore and offshore oil and natural gas development provides additional volumes of natural gas that can substitute for coal combustion, it would substantially lower the IMF estimates of the effective subsidy. In addition, the report makes no adjustment for revenues collected by federal, state, and local jurisdictions for oil and gas development of public and private lands. And according to the Department of Interior, the federal government alone collected over $100 billion in oil and gas revenues between 2005 and 2015. A further limitation of the paper is it doesn't effectively address uncertainty in calculations from the environmental costs of oil and gas use, especially given advances in control technologies. The paper has no estimate of environmental costs from wind or solar or hydropower. It discusses benefits of making fuel more expensive, but not benefits of making it less expensive. No estimate of benefits from fossil fuels, such as availability of electricity, drinking water and sewage systems, cooking systems rather than wood or dung, health benefits, or benefits from the idea of manufacturing jobs are given by the IMF paper, and there are many benefits from fossil fuels.
Agriculture is very important to Iowa's economy. Over the course of these climate change hearings, we've heard from Democrat witnesses who support market-altering and consumer policies to limit fossil fuel consumption and drive down emissions. Conveniently, they ignore the devastating impact that their policies would have on working-class Americans and small businesses, including family farmers. What role do fossil fuels play in maintaining food security domestically and abroad? And I know you touched on this a little bit in your opening statement.
Yeah, not only our energy security, but our agricultural production and food security depend on fossil fuels. Raising the price of fossil fuels raises the cost of food, and poor and middle-class people pay the price. Fossil fuels are essential for food production because of nitrogen used in fertilizers. In 2021, Sri Lankan President Rajapaksa banned synthetic fertilizer and pesticide imports. Prices rose in Sri Lanka and there were riots. Protests are also occurring in the Netherlands and in Belgium as policymakers attempt to curtail fossil fuels in agriculture. Farmers are rioting because they're losing their livelihoods in the name of fighting climate change, as European governments seek to reduce emissions of nitrogen oxide and ammonia, which are vital inputs to modern agriculture. European farmers are being told that because of the aim for net zero emissions, their industry is being phased out, and this disproportionately hurts poor people who have to pay more for food and who cannot afford to do so.
The Biden EPA recently proposed a new emission standard for light and medium-duty vehicles. This rule would require 2/3 of the new cars to be electric by 2032. Given your background as an economist, can you speak to this rule's feasibility and the cost it would impose on our economy and the consumer?
Well, it would impose massive costs on the economy. It would require 60% of new vehicles sold to be battery-powered electric in just 7 years, and right now 6% of vehicles sold are battery-powered electric. These new electric vehicles cost more. Charging also costs more. Used electric vehicles will be hard to find, and most Americans buy used vehicles because you don't know how long the battery is going to last. And electric vehicles take longer to recharge. They don't go well in cold climates. That's why there are only 510 of them in Wyoming and fewer in North Dakota and South Dakota, because the range is very limited. They harm the environment through mining for minerals, and many of these minerals are mined with child labor or slave labor. Electric vehicles will make America weaker and China stronger because the electric batteries and components are made in China, as opposed to oil and natural gas, which is produced by Americans with well-paying jobs here in the United States.
Thank you.
Senator Kaine, then Senator Johnson.
I want to thank the chair for calling this important hearing. When we talk about things like externalities and social costs, it can often seem like a theoretical concern, and some of the discussions that I've been in about climate change over the years has suggested that it's a tomorrow issue, but I just want to tell you in Virginia, it's a today issue. We have one of the most vulnerable parts of the United States in terms of sea level rise in the Hampton Roads area. And in Appalachia, we are seeing extreme weather patterns that are creating more and more events of extreme rain, flooding that damages homes, people's livelihoods, infrastructure, schools, and roads. Interestingly enough, some of the rain data in Virginia on an annual basis is not changing that much in these communities. It's just that the frequency, the randomness, the severity of storms is changing, and the infrastructure was not really built for that. And so now when we talk about climate change in Virginia, including in some areas that have traditionally been producers of fossil fuel, the coal fields of Southwest Virginia, people understand it's not a tomorrow issue or it's not somebody else's issue, it's theirs. We also see species disappearing in our national park, species that require a certain temperature level to reproduce. As temperatures rise, they have to move higher and higher up in the Shenandoah National Park, for example, and eventually the acreages where they can live and reproduce are disappearing. We also, in Virginia, see the effects of fossil fuel industries in other ways. Black lung disease affects those who mine coal. If you mine Appalachian coal, you have about double the chance of getting black lung disease as miners of coal in other parts of the country because of the way the coal is set up and the other components that are there. So these are very, very serious issues and important to us. If I could ask to Dr. Guyer and Dr. Deziel, when Congress has programs that address the social costs of a specific activity, such as black lung treatment and benefits related to coal mining, can you talk about why it's important to ensure that we internalized the cost with policy such as this?
Thank you, Senator. First, I think you remind me of an occupational hazard of being an economist, which is I tend to talk in theoretical concerns. So I appreciate the reminder that we all need every day. These are real people facing real harm. Having said that, I'm going to slip back into technical terms. The reason why we need to reflect the true cost of our activities, including our burning of fossil fuels, is for everything that you alluded to. This is an activity that causes real damages, not just in the sense of global climate change, but in the local pollutants that my colleague here, Nicole, was talking about, and as you alluded to. And so the kind of pointed-headed academic textbook answer at its heart is to help real people and to have a flourishing and dynamic economy that accounts for the cost of the activities that spur that economy. And that's why, as I said before, the policies that we need to look at or that I would recommend for all of you is to ensure that the burning of fossil fuels accounts for those costs, those very real costs that affect Americans.
Dr. Deziel.
Thank you so much, Senator, for raising the issue of the workers. The oil and gas extraction workers have a high fatality rate. Workers die each year from explosions, falls, vehicle accidents, and then there's also the exposures to all the chemical hazards. They're closest to the hazards, whether it be benzene, hydrocarbons, silica dust, which also causes lung diseases. And the workers are often overlooked and understudied. Most of the health research has really focused on the community, in part due to difficulty accessing worker sites. So I think this is an extremely important issue that should be factored into these analyses.
And if I could say, Mr. Chair, the reason that I appreciate you doing this hearing is we have proven unable during my time in the Senate to do big, meaningful climate legislation in a bipartisan way. The first climate bill that was introduced in the Senate was a bipartisan bill, John Warner and Joe Lieberman, but we've been unable to do it in a bipartisan way. We were able to make some significant advances in the Inflation Reduction Act, and we did some things in the infrastructure bill that had bipartisan votes that can help us. But we do climate legislation a lot. If you count coming in after the fact to try to do a flood insurance program, to try to do a Superstorm Sandy cleanup package, to have a black lung benefits program. We don't do the prevention and go at root causes very well, but we are willing to do legislation at the back end when it's really expensive to do it often. And I appreciate the fact that we can get bipartisan votes for a flood relief or black lung benefit program or other programs on the back end. I just am convinced we need to do more on the front end, and this hearing helps us focus on that, and I appreciate it, and I yield back.
Thanks, Senator Kane. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Geyer, you're an economist, so I want to go and compare and contrast fossil fuels versus green energy in terms of subsidies, in terms of externalities, in terms of benefits. So let's first talk about the cost of subsidies. In your testimony, you said that the subsidies in the U.S. for fossil fuels is about $12 billion over 5 years, correct? The Inflation Reduction Act, I think it's over 10 years, over about $400 billion, but a Goldman Sachs study said to be closer to $1.2 trillion. So just comparing that $12 billion versus $1,200 billion worth of costs, sure subsidizing a whole lot more green energy, correct?
According to those numbers, yes.
100 times higher costs. And that's just one piece of legislation. Let's talk about the benefits. I think it's undeniable that fossil fuels are going to power 80% of our economies decades in the future, correct? So when you're powering 80% of the economy, you're paying for air conditioning to allow people to escape the heat. Certainly, China and India are going to use fossil fuels to lift their people out of poverty. Ms. Geyer, do you believe there's any chance whatsoever that India and China are going to stop using fossil fuels?
Nor do I think we will, yes.
Right, zero chance of that, okay? Are you aware of the climate alarmist studies? Their own models show that even if we eliminated all CO2 emissions in the United States, it would have a negligible, less than a degree difference in terms of what their projections say in terms of climate change.
I don't know which models you're referring to. I don't think that's true.
Pardon?
I don't think that's true, but I don't know what particular models you're referring to.
Okay, again.
Well, you have to make
So my point being, okay, we could eliminate all this. We could shoot ourselves in the foot, spend $1.2 trillion, have no impact on climate whatsoever, and still have 80% of our power provided by fossil fuel. I think that's crazy. Now let's talk about externalities, okay? No doubt about it, and I think it'd be nice to be able to figure out some way to price that in. But, the pollution from the extraction of fossil fuels plus the pollution from burning them, you've got to acknowledge that. But there are also externalities to green energy, correct? Here's one right here. This is a photo of a cobalt mine in the Congo. There's child abuse going on here. This is child labor. Is that okay because it's just not occurring in the U.S.? Why are we not accounting for all of the mining that is going to be required to provide the copper, the lithium, the rare earth minerals, the cobalt? Have you studied that cost of externalities? Have the climate alarmists studied that? Are they accounting for whatsoever? Not to mention the impracticality of actually mining enough to produce the number of electric vehicles they're contemplating. Ms. Roth, can you speak to that?
It's very important to be able to take into account all these different costs of mining, and I find it very surprising that people who are against coal mining in the United States are in favor of mineral mining in the Congo.
Because it's happening someplace else.
It's happening
correct?
Someplace else, exactly.
Yeah, no, again, I think it's kind of grotesque, pretty arrogant. Dr. Deziel, can you tell me what is the biggest adverse event? What's the major one that you're finding in your studies from fossil fuels?
The strongest evidence is for risks to children, like preterm birth and birth defects.
Okay, so what is the background rate of the birth defects that you're talking about? What's the background rate?
Birth defects are quite rare, but we see an additional increase.
Okay, so I'm asking what's the background rate of a birth defect in hundreds of thousands? What's that background rate?
Well, I can double check on the statistics, but I think
this is your study.
Yes, about 3% of births have a.
Okay, 3%. What is it then due to, in your studies? How does that increase? What does it go to? Does it go to 5% or 6%, or what is the increase off of that 3%?
Thank you, Senator. In the studies, we find that there's about a 20% increase in risk, which is not to say a 20% increase in number of cases, but there's a 20% greater chance of birth defects in children whose mothers live near oil and gas.
So that means it would go from 3% to 3.6%? Is that, I mean, again, I'm trying to understand your study. It's very easy to play with statistics. It's very easy to scaremonger, which is what climate alarmism is all about. But you have to actually take a look at the reality situation. Again, China and India are not going to stop using fossil fuels, nor are we. So we can continue to spend trillions of dollars and have no impact on any of these things, or we can actually concentrate on the things we can fix. And again, if there's some real problems, living around drilling, that's something we can fix without spending $1.2 trillion. So again, I'm trying to figure out what is the reality situation. What does your study actually show?
Well, in my study and others, we see...
You may answer the question, and then it's Senator Marshall's turn.
Thank you. Yes, we see up to, for another example, another one of my studies, we saw a doubling of risk of childhood leukemia in children whose mothers lived within 2 kilometers of oil and gas sites. And this is consistent across more than 50 epidemiological
Well, I'd like to see your actual data. I don't like the percentages, I want to see the data. Okay, thank you.
Senator Marshall.
Thank you, Chairman, and I'm sorry to pick on you, Dr. Deziel, but I also want to follow up on the studies. I didn't know that's where my colleague was going to take you. How many of your studies you talk about did multi-regression analysis?
Most of the 50 studies that I've been referring to used multiple regression analysis, meaning they controlled for many other
Yeah, I know
factors.
what it means. And you mentioned the word association as opposed to statistically difference. So did any of these have a statistical difference, or were they all just associations?
Most of the studies observed statistically significant associations, meaning an increased risk of
Well,
health
that's two different. You're the epidemiologist, but those are two different terms from a study. To say there's an association versus statistical difference, meaning 2 standard deviations outside of the mean.
Most of the studies did observe statistically significant.
Then what in your testimony did you use the word just associated?
Just trying to use simple terms.
Okay, all right. Well, that's helpful. I mean, so much of this is done with religion as opposed to science, so we're trying to see where we can agree on the science. Dr. Gary, for you, you're the economist here. 2 of the tax benefits that are often talked about are the percentage depletion allowance and the intangible drilling cost. If we eliminated those, how would they impact someone like Exxon or Shell, Chevron, some of those big oil companies?
Marginally. I think every study, if you look at the full suite of tax expenditure subsidies, have only a marginal effect on promoting production. So it would increase their tax bill for sure, but as far as production and prices go, it would have a de minimis effect.
So my understanding that the folks that benefit from these, from the bottom line, are the small producers like in Kansas making 5 or 10 barrels per day, and that these larger companies don't benefit from them. So I think that's a common misconception, and I think it's so important for national security that we have more than 4 big oil companies making oil and gas for this world, and that these small oil producers need those to stay in business. I want to talk about methane for a second as well, and probably go back to Dr. Deziel. A third of the methane produced in this country is from wetlands, and about 20% from city landfills. You spoke about methane in particular. Did your studies take that into account? Were these locations close to some type of wetlands or to city landfills as well?
Thank you for the question. Actually, my studies did not focus on methane. My studies focused on more of the hazardous emissions coming from oil and gas sites. Methane contributes to climate change, so in that sense it's hazardous, but my studies looked at the more immediate consequences of exposures to toxic.
But certainly methane is one of the major concerns for greenhouse gases from the oil and gas industry. Certainly oil and gas industry needs to own that about a third of them do come from the oil and gas industry, but a third of them come from wetlands as well. So are you suggesting we should, bulldoze in the wetlands too? It's a rhetorical question. I shouldn't have asked it as well. So often in in this world we live in D.C., we try to think about the environment in different perspectives. And certainly I just want the chairman to know, my friends across the aisle, that I want to leave this world cleaner, healthier, and safer than we found it. But also we need to think about affordability and reliability when it comes to energy as well. That this administration's policies have been an attack on certainly American energy. It's been an attack on American agriculture, and it's been an attack on the hardworking Americans as well. When we see grocery prices going up 20, 25%, energy cost, oil and gas, utility cost as well going up over 30%, that's an attack on hardworking Americans. So I guess my question is, when we make policies, do we ever think about the affordability and the reliability of energy as well? I think I'll just leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Question was rhetorical. You're not seeking an answer from any of the witnesses. The question was rhetorical, just to be clear.
No, it's not rhetorical. I think I'm just out of time and trying to be respectful of our time. Thank you.
I think next up is Senator Lujan.
Chairman, thank you very much, and thank you and Ranking Member Grassley as well, and to all of the panelists that are with us today. Dr. Gayer, I particularly appreciated your statement that energy policy should account for the sizable external cost of energy production. We know what these costs are. The cost is climate change, the cost is air pollution, the cost is damage to our environment as well. One of the costs that I've tried to address is the cost of oil and gas wells that have been abandoned by the industry. Too often, oil and gas companies fail to plug their wells when production ends. Some of those wells then go into different ownership, but we saw this enormous problem that fortunately colleagues came together in a bipartisan way to agree that they should be plugged. As a result, the wells pose significant risk to the environment and surrounding communities by leaking toxic chemicals into the air, contaminating groundwater, and contributing to climate change through methane emissions. One of the abandoned wells that I visited before passage of the bill was in an area where there was cattle grazing. And anyone that is familiar with these wells knows that there's a bucket, if you will, that's connected to the tank where a truck will go up and they connect. While this particular well had been abandoned, the cattle were still eating in the area and they were drinking from that bucket. And there was a lot of stuff in there, as you can imagine. And so it's just one example of a challenge that I witnessed personally that needed to be fixed. So millions of abandoned wells across the nation needed to be cleaned up, hence working together in a bipartisan way on the REGROW Act. This bill provided $4.7 billion to plug oil and gas wells that were abandoned by those who profited from leaving this mess behind. This wasn't about leaving things better than you found them. This wasn't even cleaning up after yourself. Now, under current statute, we have no choice but to remediate them at taxpayer expense to prevent the continued suffering of disadvantaged communities. So my question, Dr. Gayer, is yes or no, is it irresponsible of energy companies to abandon their oil and gas wells and force taxpayers to pick up the tab for cleanup?
I don't know the particular examples. My short answer is yes. My long answer is to commend. I think you're right. This is an issue that carbon taxation has lots of merits, but it's not going to meaningfully address the concern of abandoned wells. So regulatory, legal liability, and in this case, public funding to clean up the mess, I think is the right way to do it.
You touched on my follow-up question, which was, do you believe that operators should be held responsible for their activities impacts up front before drilling begins rather than offloading the burden on taxpayers?
So one of the risks is you're asking a legal question to an economist, so I don't know the legal aspects and I don't know what the current existing law is, but certainly we should have a legal apparatus where you cannot abandon harmful materials and leave it to either harm people or for the federal government to intervene ex post.
I appreciate that. Dr. Deziel, Last year, Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, and this historic piece of legislation is accelerating the transition to a clean energy economy, creating millions of good-paying jobs and providing cleaner air and better health for us. There was a substantial investment, $369 billion in production and investment tax incentives to promote technologies that improve air quality and reduce emissions. Yes or no, will the Inflation Reduction Act improve public health by reducing air pollution?
Thank you, Senator. Engineering controls, like emission controls that can be implemented at oil and gas sites is certainly an important public health tool for the fossil fuel industry. However, it's not enough. These devices only capture certain pollutants, like air pollutants or potentially methane. They do nothing to address noise, water contamination, traffic, the degradation of the landscape. So they're an incomplete solution to the public health issue of oil and gas extraction. So they'd have to be coupled with some other strategies.
Do you think repealing the Inflation Reduction Act would damage the health of citizens across the country, especially children and the elderly?
I think we need as many protections, layers of protections as we can get, including air emission controls would protect public health.
Why do we need more protections? Why do we need more of those tools?
Well, oil and gas sites have been shown to emit toxic air pollutants and methane. Many studies have concluded that.
So if there are fewer of those protections, then that would lead to a concern with public health?
Yes, fewer protections would mean more exposures and health risks to nearby communities.
I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, that sounds to me like if there was a repeal of the Inflation Reduction Act, that it would create damage to the health of citizens and the elderly and children as well. I thank you for the time and appreciate the panelists being here.
We turn to Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been listening to the entire conversation, just not from here, but I've been involved in it as a Republican from almost the time I got here in the U.S. Senate. And my interest in climate goes way, way back further than that. So never seen anything where there could be two more disparate views. And you heard it, I think, eloquently from Chairman and Ranking Member Grassley earlier. The question is, how do you sort through all of this? What is the truth? This is the Budget Committee. I'm going to weave it back into that discussion here in a moment. But the fact is, for as long as we've been talking about it, whatever modeling has been out there has probably not been that good because it's not, I think, created enough urgency for many that dismiss the idea as even being out there worth discussing. And on the other side, I don't think it's given enough certainty to where you do what we've done so far, which is give so much advantage to our geopolitical competitors that are the gross emitters that are there growing their economies, building coal-fired plants nearly weekly in places like China and India. So how do you sort it all out? Well, I think then you got to come back and take what has been kind of weak information, modeling that if it was that good, the case would be made, and how do you survive into the future to do something about it? Then let's look at what else is in play. This comes back to budget. We're currently running $2 trillion deficits. And I think if the other side of the aisle had its way, it would even be deeper than that because there would have been more legislation based upon borrowing money on something that's a little amorphous in general. Let's look at the other side. Started the Climate Caucus here with Chris Coons back in July, I think, of 19, and there's clear consensus, I think, across the economic community here in this country that something is afoot. When I talk to the main stakeholders, even in places like Exxon, Chevron, they say there's an issue. They also tell me they have no idea how they're going to get beyond the low-hanging fruit. In other words, past the things they have committed to do 2030 to 2035. And the consensus I hear mostly is that it's going to take some technological breakthrough that we haven't even found yet. A lot is working there as well. So do you absolutely plow forward to where it's the concept of present value? Present value in finance means the variables you know about are what is happening closer to the present. In other words, if you're investing so much currently, you don't know how it's going to turn out until you get the uncertain cash flow that occurs down the road. I think that's where we're at. I know as one who got texts when you got involved in climate, have you gone to the dark side? Don't think so. I think we ought to be in the conversation. And I get that politically from young Republicans, young conservatives, faith-based communities, from evangelicals to Catholics. And then you throw farmers in there who are conservative politically by nature, who know something is afoot. I'm still involved in that, and I'd have to agree with them. But it gets back to my original point. A lot of this is amorphous information that has not been modeled well. Then let's come back to the financial point. We are consistently going broke as a country because we're projected to be $51 trillion in debt in just 10 years. That is close enough to where that's a key figure you can stick into the present value analysis. That's not good. How do you deal with things out of your control where you've got the two biggest emitters in the future that seem to be giving it lip service only? And in business, in anything else, you've got to mix the short-run survivability with your long-term goals. We should have never gotten rid of our energy independence like we did, because I think that's caused political problems across the spectrum, especially on the other side of the aisle. Budget deficits that look like they're going to get worse rather than get better. What do we do with it? Where do we go from here? We obviously don't want to add further to the present value of pain financially. We need to revive whatever it's going to take to have reliable base load production on the electric side. We're going to need to, transportation is going to have to be looked at. It would overtax the grid in a way that we couldn't do it, but we still need to navigate towards something that's affordable. I put this out there now as a statement. I'll have a few questions if you're going to do a second round. I want to respect that. But I'm saying that the most important thing is we've got to survive into the mid and long term financially, and we currently don't look like we're doing it in the way we run the federal government in general, whether it's on health care, whether it's on climate, whether it's on anything else we do. I'll yield back, and if there is time for further questions, I'll have a few.
I'd be delighted to make time for further questions and to have a second round. Senator Kaine will lead off with that. Let me just say before Senator Kaine begins his questioning that I would like to take a moment to express my admiration for you and the sincere and thoughtful way you've addressed these issues. You've been a good person to work with on climate solutions. And to your point that if I had my way, the debt number would be much higher, I would just like to say I think the debt number would be much lower because I actively support a robust carbon price, and I actively support cleaning up the tax code of its many, I would say, corrupting inequalities. And between those two, that would create significant deficit-reducing revenues. But with that, let me turn to Senator Kaine and then back to Senator Braun and then Senator Lujan if he wants to.
I will be less than a minute, and it's just a point that I wanted to raise, inspired by a question that my colleague Senator Lujan asked. He asked whether the repeal of the Inflation Reduction Act would have direct effects on people's health. And I want to point out in one way it would, and it was one of the lesser discussed parts of the Inflation Reduction Act. Obviously, the IRA dealt with prescription drug costs. The IRA dealt with clean energy, but the IRA also had a really important public health provision, which is fully funding the Black Lung Benefit Program. That program had been funded on an excise tax on coal extraction, but it was set at a level that fully funded the program, but then that excise tax expired and was not reauthorized, and it rolled way back, which put the burden of the program on the backs of general taxpayers rather than coal companies. In the Black Lung Benefit, in the Inflation Reduction Act, we did a permanent fix of the financing of the Black Lung Benefit Program so that the miners in Virginia and elsewhere who face this significant risk of black lung disease, and in Appalachia, because of the condition I mentioned earlier, folks are getting diagnosed with black lung disease earlier and earlier and earlier in their careers. It used to be something that somebody would get diagnosed with maybe in their late 40s or 50s. It's not uncommon to see coal miners in their 30s now getting diagnosed with black lung disease because of the conditions, the amount of silica and other components that they have to breathe as they are doing coal extraction. But we fixed, we haven't made coal mining safer, but we did fix the benefit program so that at least people who get diagnosed can count on the fact that benefit program will be there. If the IRA was repealed, we would go back to a situation where the funding would not be there and people wouldn't be guaranteed that they could have access to a program that would protect their health in the tragic circumstances of black lung benefit diagnosis. So I just wanted to acknowledge that was a really important part of the IRA, especially in Virginia and other coal mining states, and a repeal would throw that program into jeopardy and thus hurt people.
As we switch back to Senator Braun, let me put into the record the announcement from EPA regarding its pollution standards for cars, light-duty trucks, reporting that reduced fuel and maintenance costs under the proposed standards would save the average consumer $12,000 over the lifetime of a light-duty vehicle as compared to a vehicle that was not subject to the new standards. And with that, Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When it comes to the whole budget discussion, I'm going to just briefly give an answer to Chairman's comments. Running $2 trillion deficits, the Trump tax cuts, which, by the way, were getting close to paying for themselves pre-COVID, that is chump change, $150 billion per year. So that is only 7.5% of our current deficits. Carbon tax, that's something that I'm not sure how you'd model that in terms of what it would do, but until we get our spending in line with historical revenue generation, which is always average 17.5% to 18% of our GDP, other than 3 years in the Clinton administration, we just don't have an economy that will give us more revenue. And if you do tax it more, you will have lower economic growth over time. That's another consideration philosophically in terms of what you do with budget. My question to all three of you would be, the fact that you've got the now second largest economy and the soon to become third largest economy, India, which is about ready to eclipse Japan's economy, when they're plowing forward, Senator Johnson talked about some of it, what's happening elsewhere. How do you justify, from your own points of view, when that is a reality, and you can actually put some numbers down there, and where the savings in terms of what you do by mitigating climate has got a little more speculation to it? Give me the pros and cons from each point of view of how we navigate through all that. And if you want to throw it in the context that we're borrowing nearly 30 cents on every dollar we spend here, which is a budget consideration, if you want to spend money, how do we justify doing that? We'll start over there, Doctor, on the left.
Thank you, Senator. First, I want to commend you for the framing of the problem. You did say that there's no more disparate views. Maybe I'm being overly optimistic. I hear equal concern for the welfare of Americans, whether or not it's health or whether or not it's economic. And so I'm going to try and sell you a little bit on why I'm for a carbon tax. A carbon tax is less intrusive. It'll spur innovation. It'll protect the economic interests of Americans. It's a simpler approach. I think it's a market-friendly approach. That's why I'm for it. So the way that I can...
How much roughly a year would you say that's going to generate?
It certainly depends on the tax, but you're right. It's probably in the order of 100 to 200 billion, something like. And then,
so then again, we're talking just
I could
five.
interrupt for the record. My carbon pricing bill was priced out at about $2 trillion over 10 years.
Okay,
in revenue.
That would be then.
Yeah.
That would be then.
That would align with.
Yeah, 10% of our current deficit. So that means it's a lot of room to go from that and say changing tax policy. Still, we're spending a lot of money that we can't generate through tax policy.
Sure.
Go ahead.
And my point is it helps, and also
Yes.
the reducing the fossil fuel subsidies, although not massive, even smaller help.
But the heaviest
for the
lifting would have to be done through spending if you want to get to a
or
balanced budget.
taxes. Yep,
Yep.
that's right. So, I guess I'm trying to be a little bit more optimistic that there's a policy out there that kind of joins the two sides and their concerns on both the economic and health consequences of our energy use. On China, I commend you also. It's an issue. It's a global pollutant. Now, we heard today about the local pollutant effects. Those are real. Those have nothing to do with China in the sense that, addressing fossil fuel use here would help the health of Americans in that sense. But on the global sense, you're right. We have China, we have India. It's a global problem. Again, I think I come from a bit of optimism on my policy here. One, we don't doubt that this is a serious problem, so we can't just say because we can't solve the global issues, we can ignore it. I certainly think if we don't have smart policy that addresses the issue domestically, other countries are less likely to act. But indeed, reciprocity should be part of it, which is, again, the border adjustment tax helps with that. And again, I'll get to what I said before. Like, I think a price signal will lead to innovations. I think it will give you the tech breakthroughs that you said are necessary. I think that's where the answer lies. And quite honestly, as we've seen in other sectors, if Americans have tech breakthroughs, the Chinese will adopt that technology. And so I think there's real hope there as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator, for the thoughtful question. I am not an economist, so I'll just briefly say that the studies that I have cited are not about modeling the future. They're not amorphous. They're about kids who already have cancer, have birth defects, have asthma. And so addressing fossil fuel now will have very real impacts to communities today. And that energy justice is an incredibly important issue. We all deserve access to reliable and affordable energy, but just not at the expense of fence-line communities. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question. I would say no, in order to help the deficit, we could repeal the $570 billion of green tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act without repealing the whole act, thereby leaving the black lung program provision as it is. I'm against a carbon tax because it's regressive. It hurts poor people the most. Their prices go up for appliances, for food, for other kinds of things. The border adjustment, according to the World Trade Organization, might not be completely legal, so we might have foreign products coming in at lower costs than American products. An additional tax would slow GDP growth in the United States. These taxes are never perfect, and it's always difficult to estimate the amount of carbon in a particular product, and so you might find some exemptions, some not. Most importantly, this is very similar to a value-added tax, which we have seen rise over time. They start small. Europe has a 20 to 25% value-added tax that started very small. Canada's was rising also. And Congress, you senators are unlikely to repeal the income tax or any other tax. So this would be one tax layered on top of another tax. America's air has been getting steadily cleaner. The 6 criteria pollutants, if you look at the EPA data, it's getting cleaner all the time because of our use of clean natural gas. If we offshore production to China, they are making these electric batteries, the wind turbines, the solar panels with coal-fired power plants. It's not reducing global emissions or helping climate change. What we need to do is use our own oil and natural gas resources and encourage other countries to use clean natural gas also, either by us exporting it or by us exporting the technology so that they can do fracking also. That would be far more useful than these $570 billion in green tax credits, many of which, by the way, are going to be benefiting China. EVs now, apparently, they don't have to be made in the United States to get the credit if they are leased, because they count as commercial vehicles, which opens a loophole to, again, subsidizing China, making China stronger and the United States weaker. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for your comments. And one final conclusion in terms of a comment from me. We're entering into a much broader discussion. It's right in front of us now with the what's happening over in the House in terms of debt limit and all of that. I come from the world of being an entrepreneur with an emphasis on finance, and I can tell you that you can't run any enterprise like we're currently running it. And since the Gulf Wars to date, we've been taking our country and its balance sheet into a place that, regardless of what you want to do here, it's not healthy. The crowding out effect of interest in and of itself is going to be a heavy weight that gets worse each year. And all I can tell the American public, whoever's listening, the numbers always win. You can't escape them. And currently, we're in a place where we've got time, but it takes political will and discipline, just like you'd have to exercise in any other venue to kind of rein things back in so that this place is healthy for all the people that look to it for whatever reason it might be. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Braun. One clarification, if you don't mind, Dr. Gare. If natural gas is used as a feedstock for fertilizer and not combusted, does it pay a carbon tax?
If it depends where you're administering the carbon tax. So there's different. I'm trying to think from memory on this side. Is if you levy it at its source, then it would be in the price.
Unless an adjustment were made for...
I mean, there's a question of how much, you can't get 100% of it, and so you can make adjustments for where you want to levy the price, how far upstream you levy the price.
And if we wanted to exert pressure on countries like China and India to move off of fossil fuels and to accelerate their transition to clean energy, what U.S. policy would most likely accomplish that?
Well, that was what I was mentioning to your colleague before. I think the carbon tax is both credible, it's supportive of a strong U.S. economy, it helps us transition our energy, it leads to technological innovation, and it helps us both from a diplomatic point of view and also from a technological transfer point of view to get other countries to move in a similar direction.
With a robust border adjustment, obviously.
Exactly. So, yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Furchtgott-Roth, welcome back to hearings with me. As you know, you're a frequent flyer here in the halls of Congress, and I think always called by the Republican side, and with an astonishing range of expertise. My review of your testimonies is that you've testified on subjects as diverse as the capital gains tax, the challenges of the 21st century workplace, Chief Justice Roberts' record on women's rights, education reform, the Paycheck Fairness Act, residency and right to work issues, medical bankruptcy reform, Samoan fisheries subsidies, the gender pay gap, a balanced budget amendment, that the Affordable Care Act would lead to high unemployment rates, that to help older workers find jobs, we should roll back the Affordable Care Act, eliminate EPA regulations on coal, and approve the Keystone XL pipeline, on sequestration, on health insurance, on taxation, on empowerment in the workplace, on job vacancies, on the American Rescue Plan telling employees not to show up for work, and on a range of climate-related issues. Is that a pretty fair summary of the breadth of your testimony across various congressional committees?
Yes, I'm fortunate to have been able to write 6 books, hundreds of articles. I've been chief economist of the Labor Department, the equivalent of chief economist of the Treasury Department, and chief of staff of the Council of Economic Advisors.
Yeah,
so I've had a lot of experience.
That's in your resume, and you
yes, and,
worked before for the American Petroleum Institute, is that correct?
4 years at the American Petroleum Institute, but
and
unfortunately...
then you worked at the American Enterprise Institute, is that correct?
Yes.
And then the Hudson Institute?
I did work for the Hudson Institute.
And the Manhattan Institute?
Yes.
And now the Heritage Foundation?
Yes, yes.
And every single one of those groups is funded by the fossil fuel industry, is that not true?
Well, unfortunately, I don't have the benefit of being able to rely on a family fortune made in the Minnesota gas business or having my spouse's family fortune come from United Gas. And the Heritage Foundation is a club that anyone can join, not just white people. During 2021, it had hundreds of thousands of individual foundation and corporate supporters representing every state in the United States.
Do you know how much funding it received from the oil and gas baron Koch industries? political operation?
The top 5 corporate givers provided the Heritage Foundation with only 1% of its 2021 income. Individuals contributed 82%, foundations 12%, corporations 1%, program revenue and other income 5%.
Well, the answer is that it's over $5 million from the Koch's various foundations since 1996, from Donors Trust and Donors Capital Fund, which are the great pass-throughs for the fossil fuel industry, to obscure their role. Heritage has received over $2 million. It's received nearly $750,000 from Exxon since 1998. In 2019, Heritage reported on its tax return that its various direct mail, telemarketing, and fundraising efforts were responsible for 19 of the $117 million it received. Can you explain where the other $98 million came from?
As I said, we have hundreds of thousands of individual donors, and I have been writing, as you point out, the same things throughout all my career as a professional economist, beginning in 1985. And what I write doesn't depend on where I work.
You wrote, for instance, in a Forbes column last year that renewables actually increase global emissions. Do you stand by that comment?
Yes, because they are made with coal-fired power plants in China. I did explain that if renewables that wind turbines and solar panels are made, and batteries are made with coal-fired power plants in China. I did explain that if these were made with emissions-free energy, such as nuclear power, then the benefits to the environment would be much greater. But many environmentalists who are in favor of renewables are against dense emission nuclear power, and therefore making these renewables often raises emissions.
In addition to stating that renewables actually increase global emissions, have you also agreed that recent data, and I quote here, calls into question the conclusion that humans are the dominant cause of recent climate change?
I'm an economist, not a scientist.
Well, you wrote that for a Wall Street Journal opinion piece in 2015.
Yeah, well, scientists...
You stand by it here today in 2023.
Yes, scientists disagree on the human component of global warming, and in this book, Unsettled by Steve Koonin, who was Undersecretary of Energy under President Obama and who taught for 30 years at Caltech and has a PhD in physics from MIT, he says that it is uncertain how much human activity affects global warming. The case is unsettled. And I'm no better scientist than he is.
Well, thank you very much. It's notable that that is the position that the Republican Party intends to stand by. With that, the hearing draws to its conclusion. Anybody wishing to ask a question for the record would try to get that in by noon tomorrow, and 1 week from that to get any answers. So if you've got a QFR, please respond quickly with an answer within a week. And with that, the hearing is concluded. Thank you.